the 251st mass shooting this year, and today is just the 216th day of the year. 2020 presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke, who represented El Paso in Congress, joins me now. And Congressman, first of all, your thoughts on what's happened and also what we've learned about the alleged motive of this shooter.
Joy, we are just devastated here in El Paso. I don't have words to describe how we're feeling, but I will tell you that I am grateful for the first responders on the scene, the El Paso Police Department, and this entire community who is coming together and around these families and these victims. We got to meet with some of those families and victims last night. So many of them pulling through against the longest odds, multiple gunshot wounds, multiple family members shot, and showing extraordinary strength. So this is one of the strongest places in the world, and if it's ever been tested, it is now. But El Paso is going to pull through, overcome, and I hope that we're going to be able to help lead this country in ensuring that this does not continue to happen, that this is not the new normal. You asked about what we're learning from the investigation, some preliminary signs that this is motivated by hatred, by racism, specifically against immigrants here in a community that is 85% Mexican-American, where nearly a quarter of those with whom I live were born in another country. The kind of place that Donald Trump has warned the rest of America about, talking about invasions and caravans and Mexican immigrants being rapists and criminals, despite the fact that El Paso is one of the safest cities in the United States of America today. It has been for the last 20 years. So, Joy, I'm saying that there is a connection between this racism and this rhetoric, including from the president, and what we saw in El Paso yesterday. We have to put an end to it.
And you know, when you have this alleged, screed that's posted by the person who's alleged to be the gunman here, using words like invasion, and as you point out, the community of El Paso, and I've been to El Paso, it is a very fluid city with on both sides of the border. Both sides of that border really work quite well and quite intrinsically with one another. What would you expect leadership in Texas and in Washington to actually say? Because if the language of invasion has been a part of this conversation coming out of the White House, and that's the kind of language that we're seeing, what could they possibly say? What could the president possibly say at this point, in your view? You're running for president. What would you expect him to say?
Yeah. I think this is a moment where you need to specifically describe immigrants as being a source of strength and also safety and security for this country. We know, the numbers bear this out, that immigrants commit crimes at a far lower rate than those who are born in this country. And yet, despite that, the president has been trying to stoke and instill fear in this country about immigrants. And that fear found a home, it looks like, in yesterday's killer, taking the lives of at least 20 El Pasoans, fueled by a fear of those who are different. And that difference by the president described as something that is dangerous. Asylum seekers he described as animals or an infestation. Caravans that are going to invade this country. Muslims who pose an inherent risk to the United States and must be banned from entering. Neo-Nazis and Klansmen, very fine people. This helps to set the tone and create the environment for these kinds of acts of hatred and violence and intolerance. And so if we do not call that out, we will then continue to accept this as our fate and our future and the fortune of this country. And that cannot happen, not now, not going forward. And we in El Paso refuse to allow that to be the case. So let's describe immigrants as a great contributor to the safety and security of this country. Those who are different than the majority, every bit as human, every bit as American as anyone else. That's what's been lacking from the president. That's what we need right now from our public leaders.
And as somebody who, calls El Paso home and knows that community very well, what do you say to people? I've even had people say to me this morning that are just afraid to be outside now, afraid to be in public places, afraid to go to the mall, afraid to go to Walmart, afraid to go to the movies, that are just now afraid because they know this ideology is out there. They know there are people who believe that they just in their physical body are an invader. What do you say to people that are just scared today?
We have absolutely got to overcome this. I'm thinking about the people in Dayton. I'm thinking about the folks in Gilroy. I think about the acts of hatred and violence, whether it was at Mother Emanuel in South Carolina, or the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or Poway just outside of San Diego. We've got to be bigger and stronger and more confident and courageous than this hate and this intolerance right now. We've got to call it out where it exists in the highest positions of power and public trust, including in the White House right now at this moment, or else it will consume us and this country. The future is in our hands. We either accept this or we change this, and I, for one, am going to do everything within my power to change this. Not only calling that out, but reminding this country that we are a nation of immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees, that our differences must not only be tolerated but embraced as the very source of our strength and, yes, our security and our safety. That is America at its best.
And do you foresee being able to give back the presidency, which, you know, we've had, unfortunately, in this country, mass shootings for many, many years, long before now? Is there a way to give back the presidency that power to bring the country back together? Is there a way to give it back that sort of moral foundation? Are we past a certain tipping point where it's hard to put that back in?
I think the answer is yes, and I think it's incumbent upon the president to say the really tough things, the hard truths that must be spoken, lest we continue to see this kind of violence. And one of those hard truths is that racism in this country, which has always defined this country, and the relations that we have with people in this country, and some who are kept down by law, at least at a minimum, you had presidents in the past who sought to make this a more perfect union, who sought to bring people together. What we have right now is a president who encourages this kind of racism, who sees our differences as being dangerous to this country and stokes a kind of fear and racism that results in the kinds of violence that we see. We need a president who can describe the racism that we see and then the path to bring this country together, to repair the damage that has been done, and to stop visiting these kinds of injustices on future generations. That power uniquely rests with the presidency, and not only is it being squandered by our current occupant of the White House, he's in fact using that power to drive us further apart, to create more acts of violence like the one that we saw here in El Paso yesterday.